Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Risk and Margin Talks. I'm Andy Beck, and today we are here with Margaret Wheeler, and we're excited to have her part of the program. And I will let Margaret introduce herself. Take it away, Margaret.
Hi, everyone. I come into this conversation from mountain guiding. So I'm an AMGA, IFMGA guide, and I have been working in the mountains in summer and in winter in that capacity for close to 2 decades, which is sort of entertaining.
Awesome.
Best not to think about that. And then I also come into this conversation, I teach for the AMGA, so I teach guides training courses, and I also teach Pro 1s and Pro 2s for AIARE. So the background theme behind the sort of list of courses and titles and things is that I'm very engaged and interested in how we teach and how we apply risk management. And that happens for me in regards to avalanche risk, as well as other objective hazards, whether it's rockfall or icefall in the summertime.
Yeah, that's awesome. A perfect addition to the program, because one thing we've kind of found out is that this isn't just public safety, it's people that work in risky environments. And so there's going to be some common themes, I think. So maybe just real quick, explain what AIARE is, just for some people so they understand.
Sure. I joke, not joke about the alphabet soup that we have in our industry, which is take the same 4 letters and just reorganize them. Right. So AIARE is the American Institute for Avalanche Research and Education. So it's the longest of all the acronyms. Right. And AIARE is essentially, does a lot of things, but it does professional avalanche education. So we deliver that directly, Pro 1s and Pro 2s, and that's overseen by A3, the American Avalanche Association. And then AIARE also does recreational avalanche education. So that means there is curriculum. So that includes lesson plans and field books and all the things. And there also are instructor standards and instructor training to deliver the curriculum. So you don't just fall out of the sky and say, ta-da, let me tell you about avalanches. Yeah. So that has a lot to do with connecting how people think about risk kind of across the spectrum, whether it's somebody who is at an awareness level where they are just learning that there is risk, all the way up to someone who's learning how to be a lead forecaster or a lead guide for a team.
Right. Awesome. So the first question we always start with everybody is, how do you define risk?
Ooh, that one is, I'm trying not to be too much of a nerd in my answer. So if you were like sitting at the kitchen table with your family, risk is that something bad happens. It's the chance that something bad happens. And whether you call that hazard, risk, whether you are specific in those definitions, because when you start actually creating standards and dialogue around these terms, it starts to matter. But at the very core is the risk is that you'd have a negative consequence. And in our case, that negative consequence is harm to a human or danger to that human, that they would get hurt or killed. So that's kind of that's the main risk that I'm focused on.
Right. Yeah. So do you consider yourself a risk taker?
This one is not at all. Like, I am a very anxious conservative human. Yeah, which is entertaining. Because I am a mountain guide and my job is to manage risk. Right. But I've always been very risk averse. I got into ski mountaineering as a ski bum in France, which means like buying the F1 Focus used off a friend sometime in the late 90s, like no probe, no shovel, no avalanche education, and then following whoever I could keep up with. But even in that context, I was not the one in the front. I was the one in the back watching and looking and watching and looking. And there were some situations where I was exposed and didn't realize it. And they sort of confirmed my baseline. So I tried to be a pro skier in Europe too. Like, I tried to be sponsored, and I was like, it's not worth it. Like, I'm going to hurt myself. Right. And for what? I wasn't as engaged in the activities that you need to be engaged in. I wasn't engaged enough. And so, so I've always been quite risk averse. And, part of that, it gets layered on. So as a mountain guide, we spend a lot of time thinking about what can go wrong, because to the extent that we can anticipate that, we can then address it. So that initial baseline of, and it's funny because I think if you, if you asked, certainly my mom passed away a couple of years ago, but if you had asked her a decade ago if I was a risk taker, she would have said absolutely. And
Right,
we can talk
right.
more about perceived versus actual risk, but
Awesome.
I don't see myself that way. So
So our next question is, how risky do you think your job is?
mm. And this is in direct contradiction to my previous statement. I think it's quite risky.
Okay.
And the reason it's risky is
So
because
the conservative, not risk taker person works in a risky job.
exactly. So you're like, mom was onto something. No, the
Yeah.
reason I say that is because of the exposure over time.
Okay.
In other words, even if you are mitigating your risk
Right.
and you are conservative, you can decrease your exposure over time, but you do not remove it.
Right.
So that's why I think it is a risky job. And it's very hard to explain that. Somebody said that to me when I was, 10 years ago, and it's, you don't really get it. That's the problem with risk, is you
Right.
don't get it until you get it. And hopefully you didn't get killed or kill anybody else while you were getting
Right.
it.
So what do you think is the most dangerous part about your job?
There's sort of two answers to that question. And one is the generals, and then there are the specifics. And when I say generals, I mean certain situations.
Okay.
So the situations are when uncertainty levels are high, especially if you don't realize it. In other words, your awareness of your exposure isn't tracking your actual exposure.
Okay.
And it may be that you realize that, it may be that you don't. Right.
So
So there's like, I can see
situational
how,
awareness isn't where it needs to be, basically.
yes, or you're in a situation where you think you know what's going on and you don't.
Right.
Right. And there's some classic examples of that in the avalanche world, which is if you learn to manage risk in one kind of snowpack,
Right.
and then you change snowpacks, that base of experience can lead you astray. Your brain can suggest things that are not such a good idea.
Right.
So uncertainties are high. In other words, you don't know what you don't know, or you don't realize that it's not a familiar situation when your mind's distracted. Absolutely. And that's not just avalanche risk.
Right.
Like, same thing with rock climbers. If you're up high on the mountain, if you're distracted, that's when you can miss a breakdown in your systems. And then when margins are thin, that's the other piece. So it's kind of like three things. The most dangerous bits are, and if all three of those are lining up, Lord help you, then you're getting converged on. And I say those are the generals because the specifics are like, probably the most dangerous is when I am teaching someone to actually decide left or right, up or down, this side of the tree or that side of the tree. When I'm behind them and they're in the learning environment,
Yep.
then that's when the margins should be the biggest, so that when they screw up, it's okay.
Right.
But all other forces are often pushing against that to shrink the margins.
Right.
So finding that balance of how do folks have an impactful learning experience with an acceptable margin? If you mess that balance up, I think that's probably one of the most dangerous parts.
Right.
And especially in skiing,
Because
you're
you
not
want to have them have some element of risk, otherwise the slides that they're building aren't going to apply in real life, right?
Yes, unless they have an impactful experience. If you're always telling them what they need to know, they don't learn how to tell themselves. So when the course is over, you're not there. Right. So that like tip of the educational spear, like finding that balance. And over time, I've learned that you can address that issue out of the hazard in a lot of ways with good teaching techniques.
Yep.
So I think the other part is the most dangerous part of my job in the summer, this isn't avalanche risk, is essentially tied to people that are out of their element and comfort zone.
Okay.
Yeah. And so then you need to be applying other techniques when you're actually connected to someone on a rope. So they're two very different problems, the summer and the winter. We can talk about either. Yeah.
So I guess and maybe you could talk about both of them, but so was there a difference in what you thought was going to be the riskiest part of your job versus what was?
I think so. And I think that difference gets back to the time, the risk exposure over time. Yeah. Before I was a guide, before I was even thinking about being a guide, um, uh, a close friend that I met actually that first winter in Chamonix, um, the one who helped me learn how to use the F1 focus,
Which is an avalanche transceiver, right?
which is an avalanche transceiver,
Early ones, right?
which is early technology, and there were other options available at the time. So anyway, the person who taught me was killed on Denali guiding the following spring, and was like total prodigy. It was right before his 20th or 21st birthday. Super talented in the mountains, genius, like brilliant human. And so early on in my exposure to risk, other than like skiing the trees in New England, because that was my main exposure to risk, was that in the high mountains, someone who I thought was really good at stuff was killed at work.
Yeah.
And so that was
regardless of that perceived skill level.
Exactly. Yep. So that's what I thought the risks were when I got into this, was like, and I didn't even understand any of it. No avalanche education, no guides training, no exposure to mountain guiding, except for the fact that I knew that this guy guided on Denali. So that was what I thought the risks were. And then what's different is, again, over time and the realization that we are going to screw up. It's not that you can outsmart them. Like, you can outsmart the risk. You're going to screw up. So you need to set it up so that when you do, you mitigate the consequences. That's the piece that's different than I thought. That's the thing that I've learned.
That necessity to create margin basically is what was.
Yes. Yep. Because going into it, you think you can outsmart it. You think that, and it's so funny, like I'm saying words that were said to me 10 years ago, and you hear them, but you don't really connect with what they mean. You get like this much of it. So that's the part that is most different, is that you can do everything right and still screw up. In fact, you will, because you are a human and you can't leave the humans home. Like, they're always there. You can't take them away.
Well, and I think humans are unpredictable. And then the other part of it is, we hear that same answer a lot when we talk to people that deal with nature or natural type of things, whether it's somebody who's flying because you've got weather patterns, whether it's somebody who works in fire and wildland, with weather, whatever you're dealing with nature, it's just like with people, it adds that extra element because we can't completely perceive what's going on. It's just, there's some unknowns, and so then that adds that extra level, I think.
I know. I have sort of a math background, but not enough of it to do it myself. But it's like, God, it would be so great to do. You wouldn't even have to make your own system, but to essentially calculate the multiplying effect when you have a complex, chaotic, uncertain situation in nature, and then you add one human complexity,
and then two,
what the multiplier is. No, is it like to the 10? Like, but it'd be an interesting model to run. Yeah.
So do you think people outside of your job, Margaret, have the same perception of what's risky, and why or why not?
Definitely not. And that one is, in a sense, is the most understandable, right? And part of that is just awareness of mountain guiding is still a very niche profession in this country, right? And backcountry use is growing and exploding, but like overall numbers, I don't know what the percentages are, but in Europe, there's a lot of people go to the mountains. It's much more it sort of permeates deeper across the culture and into the cultures, just because of size and proximity and all that stuff, landscape. So most folks, we get the like, oh, you're a mountain guide, so do you hike? So there's general just lack of connection with what that actually is. And then it's such a complex profession. People understand in medicine that the human can do it right or wrong, and then somebody can suffer, right?
Right.
But when you engage, if you actually need medical care, you kind of realize it's basically trial and error with a decent amount of data, depending on your condition.
Yep.
And that's really disheartening for most people, because they don't think of it. They don't understand how knowledge
How could
works.
this be? It should be so set in stone what you do, right?
What to do. We should know this by now. And it's like, well, it's still trial and error at its most basic, because the systems are so complex.
Yep.
So with avalanche hazard, same thing, super complex. With rock climbing, it's interesting. People think rock climbing is really dangerous. And if you look at the numbers, avalanches are worse, right?
Right.
And part of that, I think, is because of the complexity of the hazards in rock climbing. It is just less complex.
And
Right.
you might have more control over it
Yes.
with rope systems or protection systems or
Yep.
whatever else. You don't, that isn't an option with avalanche, right?
Yep.
You can't put things into the snow to anchor it as you go across it or something like that.
Totally. Yeah. So it's like with rock climbing, at some level, you're either clipped in or you're not.
Right.
Right. And you can increase your hazard by the consequences of what happens if you fall. Right. So if you're starting at the bottom and the rope goes up above you, if you fall, you stretch. If you have a bad belay, you can strain your ankle. Right. If you are going up first, if you're leading, if you fall, you're going to actually have physics not in your favor.
Right.
And then your systems will dictate with the landscape what happens, what the consequences are.
Right.
But the level of complexity and your uncertainty, like you have a pretty high level of certainty that your rope is going to catch you when
Right.
you fall. The thing that can ruin that is rockfall can cut your rope.
Right.
So you can avoid places where there is more rockfall, go places where there is less rockfall, right? That's how you mitigate where you go. On the avalanche side of things, you don't really know where it is.
Right.
You spend a lot of time figuring out where you think it is, and then you stick a bunch of land between you and where it might be.
Right.
But you don't actually know if your rope is going to catch or not.
Right.
You don't know if you're, it's like, were we smart or were we lucky? You get very little immediate feedback.
The accidental success is always tough.
No, and from a cognitive behavioral side, the accidental success thing, I think, hoses us.
Yeah.
We won't ever get to know. We get a bunch of garbage data for our, like, were we smart or lucky question. Yeah.
Oh, I think you're right.
Yeah.
So
If
how
it was a study,
accurately
you throw it out.
within the AMGA, like guiding world, and then maybe also speak to the avalanche professionals, how accurately do you think people perceive changes in risk, like in real time, like as you're out there?
I think it
Because
depends.
we know that always happens, right? Like when we're in
Yeah.
these open, chaotic environments, like our level of risk is constantly changing. How well do you guys think you perceive that, like on a moment-to-moment basis?
It's a multifaceted answer. It does depend on a few things, one of which is your accuracy in anticipating the presence of that risk. In other words, whether you are confirming or whether you are reacting. And I think that if you are confirming, you actually have already built a response plan. And if you are reacting, you have not.
Okay.
Yes. Like big picture, zoom up to 30,000 feet. I think we're terrible at recognizing risk in the moment. That's part of the problem.
Yep.
It's too easy to miss it. And things happen so quickly, right? You could recognize that shooting crack that goes out from your ski a fraction of a second before the whole slope goes.
But it's too late.
Too late.
Yeah.
Totally. So in the moment, we're really not that good at it. The things that can make us better at it have to do with training and preparation, but it doesn't 100% protect us against situations that we didn't train or prepare for.
Right, because we don't
And
have
that environment,
to know what to look for.
Exactly. Your environment is, like you were saying, the natural environment is so complex. And then you add the human environment and it's so complex.
Yep.
So, to give a specific example, to manage avalanche hazard as a guide it's a system-wide and pretty extensive process. And the greater the complexity, the greater the level of planning. So including but not limited to years of practical experience, formal education, evaluation by your peers, right? And hopefully mentorship within there.
Yeah.
And then on the day, a group of people, ideally, looking at all the things, everything that's happened on the days before,
right?
Everything that's happened overnight since the last time they thought about it, what's going to happen with the weather, what's happening with the snowpack, what the guests are, what the terrain is, what the goals are, looking at all of that, and then actually formalizing the process of assessing what the risks are and deciding where to go in order, sort of like where do you go is how you mitigate avalanche risk. So it's very extensive. And when you do all that, then when you arrive and it is as you thought it would be, and it's risky, you can recognize that, I think, in the moment.
Okay.
If you haven't done that, you just show up. Now you're just basically walking into the teeth of the dragon. So if you know there's a dragon out there,
Right.
and you know where it hangs out, and you know where it likes to cruise around and how it flies, right? Like you can,
Right.
but there's still a dragon. Like it's not that the dragon left.
Right. Right. You just haven't seen it yet.
You just haven't seen it yet. You know where it hangs out. You know its behavior in general. But sometimes the dragon is like, I'm going to roll with the analogy. Sometimes the dragon is super erratic.
Right.
It does random things that you don't expect it to do. Other times it always goes to the same spot, eats the same nights, goes back into its cave. Like no big deal.
Right. Right.
Totally. And so then you also are like, okay, if the dragon is the erratic day, do we even go in there? Right. Is our like dragon proof outfit enough to protect us?
Right.
If it's not, we're going somewhere else. Like, yep. So it's a silly analogy, but hopefully that conveys sort of when we can be good at recognizing and when we cannot.
I think it does. I think it's a great example. So the follow-on question to that, though, is maybe it probably doesn't have anything to do with dragons, but talk about a time when you realized that or maybe it does, I don't know. But talk about a time when you suddenly realized your risk profile changed a lot. Maybe something negative happened. Maybe you realized that you barely avoided a negative outcome, you know, the accidental success, but sometime when your risk level went from like here to like right here.
Yeah. There aren't many, but there are a few. And one is personal, one and two are indirect. And the personal one is, you know, we joke about off-duty mountain guides.
Yeah.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
Because you don't have all those structures in place ahead of time. You probably do a lot of them, but you don't have all of them. The meetings, the da-da-da-da-da. You're tracking all that stuff. You're doing all the things, but you're not doing all the things usually. And then you put two of them together and it's like, well, I think they did all the things, so I'll just follow it. Like there's all kinds of professional, terrible dynamics that can evolve. Yep. So off-duty mountain guides, and also with my brother was in the mix as well. And we were in the backcountry and we knew there was like northeast aspect was bad and southerlies were okay. And we were on southerlies and then we wrapped around into a drainage and we were on easterlies. And then all of a sudden, my brother and I are at a cluster of trees. My boyfriend at the time, who's also a guide, is going from steep to flat and the whole slope drops 6 inches. And we were in avalanche terrain.
Wow.
Oh yeah, the whole thing settled. And we'd just gotten sucked around onto that northeast aspect that we had talked about. We weren't going to go there. It wasn't going to happen.
Right. So
that's a very like short, specific example of like, wow, we were taking way more risk than we planned.
Right.
On that day. You know, the sort of as a career moment, which is like to this, I mean, it's just terrible, is guiding in the summer. And this was career changing, this event. But guiding in the summer in the Alps, and Mont Blanc is actually quite a hazardous mountain. One side is rockfall, the other is deep slab avalanche with a serac hanging over it.
Yep.
Hundreds of people go up and down each one each day.
Right.
So as a young guide, you go over there and you're like, oh my gosh, there's more well-paying work than I could ever hope for guiding Mont Blanc. And sometimes the rock way up is reasonable hazard because the rocks are frozen in snow and it's cold. Other times, giant chunks of rock come pitching off that thing and nearly hit the hut, like on a regular basis. The other way up, the Trois Mots, the three summits, the deep slab is always there. It's the high alpine, and there's a serac above it. So about every 10 years or 8, serac fall, deep slab, 6 to 10 people are killed.
Right.
So the problem is that when I was on the AMGA board of directors and I was president, the advantage of that as a volunteer position is that you attend the IFMGA conferences. So it's 24 countries, the delegates come, the technical directors come, and it's amazing. And the network of folks there. And so there was the British Mountain Guides Association, a fellow named Roger Payne, and he and I were connecting on all of this human behavior and risk management stuff. And we were starting to do a bunch of work. And 2 days after I got to Chamonix for the summer, he and his clients were killed on the Three Summits route. 4 a.m. in the morning, 2 a.m. in the morning, whatever it is.
Yep.
Serac fall, avalanche, done.
Wow.
Totally life-changing.
Yeah.
I didn't really want to guide for the rest of the summer. And it changed, like it changed how I look at that slope. It's a
Right,
total, it's a total mind bender because it's the summertime, but in the
right.
high alpine,
It's still
it's a
winter.
winter snowpack
Yeah,
with basically like an undetonated bomb sitting again, sitting on top of it with the
right,
Serac. So people walk up and down, but it's a deep slab instability that just lives there. There's no forecasting. There's
right,
no, like there's zero avalanche mitigation, and yet an avalanche kills people every 6 to 8 to 10 years. Then they
yeah,
close the route for a few days, then they open it again, maybe a week. So when Roger was killed, I, it sort of is the like, that is not worth it. There are routes that are shut. They are permanently closed. That's one of them. That hazard never goes away.
right.
The only thing that goes away is your desire to acknowledge that that hazard is present.
And to go play with that dragon, basically.
Totally. Like the dragon always lives there. And when
Right,
the dragon comes out of his cave, it's like 8 people die,
right.
12 people die who were just on vacation. Like that's
Yeah,
the other. So then it was like, it was a deep, I haven't really recovered from it in that
right,
regard. I haven't really been like, well, here's what happened. It was like, no, here's somebody who is devoting his life to the human dynamics of risk management for mountain guides.
right.
Dragon came out of his cave, gone. Yeah. And it's not that he did anything wrong. There's no debrief. The only debrief is like that route is dangerous
Right,
and there's nothing you can do about it. And so what came out of that, it's a very long answer to that. Like what was that moment is that for me personally, when those routes, when you're rolling the dice, it's not worth it.
right.
Like who cares?
Yeah,
Who really cares? It's so not worth it. So that, I think that was even more than the slope settling on us. That has probably been a very defining moment.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I guess the next logical question is, in your job, how do you balance risk versus gain?
You know, there's like the easy answer, which sounds convincing. And then at its core, you still have to sort of avoid it.
Okay,
You know what I mean? So if you go at this job from a statistical, mathematical perspective,
right,
if you look at, then some are like, yeah, the chances of getting caught in an avalanche, if that's the hazard we're talking about, are relatively low. It's like, well, yeah, but the consequences are catastrophic.
right, right,
So, um, and that's, I think, a way to kind of dodge, you know, how do you balance that thing? It's like, well, it won't happen to me is a coping mechanism. Um, where I have landed is that um, my job is to bring my people back home.
right,
That's the first thing. And I actually have started limiting how much I guide folks that confuse what my job is, that my job is to bring them up to a thing.
right. Goal oriented, where you're going to start bending the map to try to get somewhere.
Yes. And the reason is in order to get to the thing, whether it's the summit or the ski, like skiers
Right,
that often don't care about summits. Sometimes they do. But if you want to get the goods, if you're on skis or get to the top,
right,
that's actually the exception. And the more complex the objective, the more things have to be in place.
right,
This we know, easy to say, but you start glossing over that when your people want to get
right,
there, and I want to get them there. That's,
right.
it's not just my people. I can't blame it. It's like as guides, we
Yeah,
want to, we're just as bad. We push ourselves to get our people to what
yeah,
they
one of
want
those
and what we
heuristic
want.
traps is, you know, that you want to show people that you're good and we want to go out and do work and send it, you know, and
Yeah.
do our thing. And so we tend to, we want to go do our thing. You see it in law enforcement, you see it in fire. Sometimes, you know, we'll get overly aggressive, and it's partly because that's what we do and we want to go be successful, you know?
Yep. And when you're young, you want to do it, so you do it. And as I've sort of matured, it sounds a bit funny, but I want my people to achieve it. Right.
Right,
And so the more things that you've already done, the less you're worried about it for you, unless you're, but that's, I shouldn't say that, because when I was pregnant and having kids, I was totally terrified that my identity wasn't going to be the same as it was beforehand. And so then you do a whole nother rash of dumb shit because you're worried about what's happening now is going to happen forever, which, side note, it doesn't. They grow up. You don't have to feed them every hour and a half for the rest of your
Right,
life. It's just for a little
right.
while.
So,
So yeah, so I think that the way that I balance that is that I am getting better at leading with it's my job to bring you home and
right.
following with and provide you with an awesome experience.
And that is a difference. Instead of a defined goal
Yeah.
saying, we're gonna go out and we're gonna spend X amount of time on the mountains and enjoy it and have some fun versus we're getting to this goal.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a difference there probably. Makes sense to
There
me.
is there's a- and it's hard to have that mindset. Even my guests that have that mindset, we all get pulled into it. And so often a way to deal with that is to dig into the education side, which is being more and more open with like, here are the hazards, here are the uncertainties, especially for my guests who are wanting to do the more aggressive objectives, the higher end stuff. They're also wanting to mentally engage,
Yeah,
right? Those two things track. And so rather than being like, I don't like this, but we're going to push it to deliver, it becomes like, hey, here's the whole laundry list. And
yeah,
these things need to be in place. And right now it's not looking like they're going to be. So
right.
we're going to go do something else. Yeah.
And that's more or less like a predefined bingo point that you sat down with not being in that dangerous environment, a logical discussion about. And then when you get out there and you see that, we pull the ripcord and go versus trying to, in the pressure of the moment, make these decisions that we really shouldn't be making. Changing plans that we planned long ago in a calm environment, you know.
Yep. Yeah. And it also has to do in the moment with managing. This is where I'm like the natural environment is complex and that won't go away.
Right.
And what I think ramps up and gets us more is the human response to that complexity. I think that's where we get into trouble. Because of the pressure of desires and the way our brains work. You know, my running, like your brain is trying to kill you is one of my taglines. And I honestly do think our brains are very often trying to kill us.
Yeah.
Because we can disassociate from consequence. Our desires are so strong. The pressures on us are so strong. I think that's what I've wanted to include as part of a curriculum for forever.
Yeah.
Is chapter heading, your brain is trying to kill you.
Right.
You need to understand that.
Ah.
Not all the time, but sometimes when it matters.
So within your job, how do you talk about risk? And I guess a side thing to that is, how do you talk about measuring it?
Mm-hmm. So this gets super nerdy and kind of fun because the more developed a profession, the more formalized a language and a system, you kind of
Okay.
add tools to talk about risk in a way that's consistent. Because as an individual, I will have my risk assessment, right? But I also need to communicate my assessment to other professionals and or to my guests or my students. And so in the avalanche hazard world, there's a paper that was worked on by a lot of people. Grant Statham is the primary author, but it's the conceptual model for avalanche hazard. And this took a lot of time, and I believe Grant is in the process of an update, but it's peer-reviewed, published paper. And what it does is actually quantify and characterize types of the hazard, so types of avalanche hazard. And the reason you care about types is it's different kind of dragons. They behave differently, right? And then there's a model for how you actually, within a type, how you then decide what its sensitivity to triggering is.
Okay.
And what it's, where it is. So first you have the type and where it is. Then you have sensitivity to triggering and its spatial distribution. So is it everywhere? Is it only in some places?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Is there like a mountain full of dragons, or is there just that one in the little couloir, right? And then from that, there's actually, it's kind of, you're figuring out what the likelihood of that avalanche problem being there. And then from there, you decide the hazard level, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the destructive potential, how much like will you get into consequences. So that's actually a model that was developed as part of this paper, and it took people a long time. And at the beginning of this, when you ask what risk is, you have to get very specific with your language, right, in order to create a structure. And the idea with this structure is anyone who's avalanche forecasting, guides, forecasters, highways, ski areas. If everyone is using the same structure, then you
Right.
can communicate about the characteristics of the hazard,
Right.
the location of the hazard, how likely you are to trigger it. When you do, what's going to happen. You can communicate about that in a consistent way.
And you can compare them more.
Yes. Yes. And so if you're in one place and I'm in another, but we're coming together in the same terrain, but I've been there, maybe a better example, if I've been somewhere for the last week and you're now coming to that same place, I can now communicate in a way that you understand all of those factors
Right.
about the hazard, which is more like compared to like, you know, we haven't seen much. I feel pretty good about it up there.
Right. Yeah. Which is subjective and yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And so the more that you can communicate specifically, which is like, we have a deep persistent slab problem at upper elevations above tree line on northeast aspects.
Right.
We've, you know, and when it's been triggered, it's gone to a size 3. That's
Right.
way different than like, we haven't seen any avalanches.
Yeah. So maybe a way to say it is like the attempt is to create a standardized system so that when you do talk about risk as a professional community, there's like a framework to use it, to make sure all the details are hit and everyone's kind of talking the same language more or less.
Yeah. Yep. Because otherwise you're not what you're saying. And it still happens. We all know this. What you say is not what people hear. It's like that George Bernard Shaw quote, the only like something about communication is the perception that it's occurred. So, but what it is doing is that it's essentially a checklist for the information that you're conveying and asking about. Right.
So along those same lines of communication, then, what impact do stories have on learning in your job?
I think they have the most important impact. Yeah. And that comes not just from my personal experience, but also the cognitive behavioral folks. You know, there's schools of how people behave and why they do things.
Yep.
But as far as I can tell, there's general consensus that what does not change human behavior is facts.
Right.
We know this.
Because
Same
we
thing.
perceive, just like when we're out in the mountains, unless we're really diligently looking for something, we see what fits our view of what's going on.
Yes.
If we think it's a low hazard environment and we're going to be good all day, then we're going to look for things that look low hazard and it's going to be good. And we're going to just mentally turn that dragon into just a rock outcropping. That's not a dragon.
No, totally.
Without even realizing we're doing it.
Yes. And over the arc of a backcountry life, we don't change our behavior based on facts. We change it based on anecdotes. So stories allow us to have an emotional experience without having it be our own. And so it's not just the like push the glasses up the nose of cognitive behavioral people. It's also watching how culture is built. So if you have a culture where the thought leaders and the influencers of that culture are like, here is how you manage risk for 10 days. And at the end of that 10 days, they are like, I have been doing this for 35 years. And here is an emotional story about where it didn't help.
Right.
You build a culture of people understanding what's underneath the system.
Right.
If the system is checking boxes, it's dead. It's not going to protect people.
Right.
If it is connected to our beliefs and our desires, then there's maybe a chance in hell that it'll stand up against what we want.
Right.
So when stories are told about impactful experiences, you know, I did it when I took my first CAA, Operations Level 1. The 3 instructors who by the end of the course, all of us are basically, they're so high on the pedestal, you can't hardly see them.
Right.
Because we're so impressed by their base of knowledge, their level of experience, their teaching ability, all the things. And they finished that course. Each instructor did a near miss or an accident that they had had at work.
Okay.
And I will never forget that. And we do that with the Pro 2, is we do the same thing. It's the forecasting class. So we spend 6 days just like pounding on people to learn how to forecast and to learn how to risk manage a system. And at the end of the 6 days, either our instructors or additional resource experts who are up on that pedestal give case histories and stories about impactful experiences. And I think that it's not the same as doing it yourself, but it is, those stories, I think, set culture, and I think culture drives behavior more than facts.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So last question. What is the difference between working to be compliant with policies and working to increase your margin and resilience?
You know, it is exactly that thing of, if your systems are alive, they will help to keep you and your public alive. If your systems are box checking, you think you're protected, and you're actually probably more exposed. So if it's compliance, whereby we're doing this from a compliance perspective, that is quite different than, this is the system we've built. Is it working? Where is it working? Where are the gaps? Right? That sort of, ISO 31000 is the International Standards Organization for risk management. And it is a one-page picture and then a whole bunch of pages after that. But the short version is, it is a visual structure for how you manage risk system-wide. And we use it for recreational and professional, because if you're not doing it system-wide, you're exposed. Right? So teaching mountain guides how to manage their own risk, if they work for an operation that doesn't have operational risk management that is alive, they're exposed at work.
Right.
Same thing with forecasters. My core message, this was my third life-changing experience of when did my risk exposure change, my risk acceptance change, is teaching the fresh-faced 20-somethings to be guides and forecasters. And I'm like, oh God. This is terrible.
And you remember where you were at that point.
Yes, you all have no idea what your exposure actually is, even though you are working very hard to understand it, quantify it, you're doing all the things.
Right.
But because you're at the beginning. So if those systems are live and the people engaging in them are constantly evaluating how well they're working and what needs to be adapted, and if it's system-wide, because I felt 10 years ago, it's gotten way better, but 10 years ago, 15, maybe 20, I felt like we were sending these fresh-faced 20-year-olds out to operations that were not managing the risk as well as they could have. And they might have been doing it for their public, but not for their workers. And then it turns out it's actually both.
Right.
If your workers are exposed, your public is exposed. They're not different. Right? Highways, maybe if the road's shut, you can still kill a highways worker without hurting the public.
Sure.
Right. So I think that is, that's the crucial piece. And that's, to be honest, I'm a risk management nerd. So I think having the systems live is amazing. And it's continually fascinating how your systems become disconnected to reality and you have to re-up them.
Yeah.
You can end up in compliance so easily. Compliance is like your safety net at the bottom of your risk management fall.
Yeah.
But it isn't the goal.
Right.
And what we're going to do is update the policies so that the people are, again, invested in them.
Right.
Because if you lag, if you're actually doing too much and you don't need to, you lose the live.
Right. Right.
So if you're being overly cautious when you don't need to be, and that's in the guiding perspective, I lose my clients, it's not that I literally lose them, but their engagement is not great. If you have a staff and you're forcing them to be overly conservative and you don't need to be, they go into compliance mode, but they're not engaged in it. So
yeah, if your checklist for your inspecting something is super long and it's longer than it needs to be, then people are just going to check yes all the way down. They're not even going to look at it. So
exactly, it loses its life. So
Margaret, we've had a good time talking to you, and I'm really glad you were able to participate in the program. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. We could go on for hours. It's a good thing we don't have the hours. I look forward to seeing this and all the other ones. It's such a great project, and there's so much interesting and engaging, fascinating stuff to talk about. So thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.